The greatest heroes in mythology were never the ones who sought glory or conquest, but those who dared to see what others could not bear to witness. They were the individuals who walked into rooms and sensed the unspoken tensions, who looked past the carefully constructed masks that society wears like armor, who recognized that the very foundations of civilized life were nothing more than collective agreements to pretend that certain illusions were real. Joseph Campbell understood this profound truth when he mapped the archetypal journey that every awakening soul must traverse. Yet, what he rarely spoke of was the terrible beauty of that first moment, when the veil lifts and you realize that everyone around you is still fast asleep, still playing roles in a drama they believe to be reality itself. This is not about becoming a cynic or withdrawing from the world in bitter disappointment. This is about the most sacred initiation imaginable, the moment when the ordinary world reveals itself as a stage set, when you begin to see that money is merely paper imbued with collective faith, that time exists only in the ticking of clocks and the anxious minds that worship them, that success and failure are costumes we put on and take off without ever questioning who we are beneath the fabric. The mythic journey begins not with a call to adventure in some distant land, but with the recognition that your own life has been a kind of sleepwalk through carefully choreographed scenes. Campbell wrote extensively about the threshold that separates the known world from the realm of transformation, but he understood that crossing this boundary requires a particular kind of courage that few possess. It is the courage to remain awake when everyone around you insists on sleeping, to laugh gently when others take their dramas with deadly seriousness, to see the elaborate game of civilization for what it truly is without losing your compassion for the players who haven't yet realized they're performing in a play. The hero's departure from ordinary consciousness doesn't happen with fanfare or dramatic pronouncements. It happens in quiet moments of recognition, when you suddenly understand that the tensions you feel in social gatherings aren't your imagination, that the masks people wear aren't temporary accessories, but have become fused to their faces through years of unconscious habit. This awakening carries with it a profound loneliness that Campbell acknowledged but rarely emphasized in his scholarly work. The hero who begins to see through the collective agreements that hold society together becomes by necessity an outsider to the very community that raised and nurtured them. You find yourself watching conversations unfold with a strange detachment, observing the subtle power games and unconscious competitions that masquerade as friendship, witnessing the desperate attempts to maintain personas that everyone secretly knows are fragile constructions. The ordinary world, which once felt solid and meaningful, begins to shimmer like a mirage, beautiful but insubstantial. Yet this is not the cynical detachment of someone who has given up on life, but rather the gentle clarity of someone who is beginning to wake up to what life actually is beneath all the stories and strategies and social positioning. You start to notice the mechanical nature of most human interactions, the way conversations follow predictable scripts, the way people respond to triggers with automatic reactions that they mistake for authentic expression. You see that much of what passes for living is actually a kind of elaborate sleepwalking, a performance of aliveness rather than the real thing. Campbell understood that this initial phase of the hero's journey requires tremendous inner strength, because the temptation is either to become bitter and superior, looking down on those who haven't yet awakened to these realities, or to retreat into complete isolation, avoiding the pain of being surrounded by unconsciousness. The true hero learns to navigate this threshold with what Campbell called compassionate detachment, maintaining love for humanity while refusing to be hypnotized by the collective trance that mistakes the stage set for reality itself. The mythic journey inward begins when you realize that everything you thought you knew about yourself and your world was just the opening act of a much larger story, one that can only unfold when you have the courage to step beyond the boundaries of what others consider normal, reasonable, or safe. This is where the real adventure begins, not in some external quest for treasure or recognition, but in the depths of consciousness itself, where the most profound transformations have always taken place. Campbell recognized that the call to adventure often comes disguised as disruption, as a shattering of the comfortable assumptions that keep us contained within familiar boundaries. For the awakening hero, this call manifests not as a messenger arriving with news of distant kingdoms to conquer, but as an internal recognition that the life you've been living feels increasingly hollow, increasingly mechanical, increasingly like a performance you never consciously agreed to give. The call whispers that there must be something more authentic, more alive, more true than the endless cycle of working, consuming, competing, and pretending that constitutes what most people call normal existence. The refusal of this call is perhaps more subtle and insidious than Campbell originally described. It's not a dramatic rejection of adventure, but rather a gradual numbing, a willingness to accept that the vague sense of spiritual claustrophobia you feel is simply the price of being an adult in a complex world. You learn to dismiss those moments of clarity as impractical idealism, to medicate the growing emptiness with distraction and achievement, to convince yourself that everyone feels this disconnected, and that questioning the fundamental assumptions of your culture is a luxury you cannot afford. The refusal looks like productivity, like responsibility, like maturity, but it's actually a kind of spiritual death that happens so gradually you hardly notice the life draining out of your days. The supernatural aid that Campbell wrote about arrives not as a wise old wizard, but as a growing capacity for solitude that doesn't feel like loneliness. You begin to discover that being alone with yourself, really alone without the constant noise of other people's opinions and expectations, is not the punishment you were taught to believe it was, but rather a gateway to a different kind of aliveness. The mentor appears as your own deeper wisdom, the part of you that has always known that life is far more mysterious and meaningful than the narrow channels society provides for its expression. This inner guide doesn't offer easy answers or comfortable reassurances, but rather poses increasingly profound questions about who you really are beneath all the roles you play. Crossing the first threshold happens when you finally acknowledge that you cannot continue living as you have been living, that the cost of remaining asleep has become greater than the risk of waking up. This crossing often appears to others as a kind of breakdown or withdrawal, a concerning retreat from the active engagement with life that society demands. They worry about your increasing need for solitude, your growing reluctance to participate in conversations that feel empty, your apparent indifference to achievements and acquisitions that once motivated you. What they cannot see is that you are not withdrawing from life but finally beginning to encounter it directly, without the mediating filters of social conditioning and unconscious habit. The threshold you cross is the boundary between living according to external expectations and living from an inner compass that you are still learning to trust. On one side lies the familiar world of automatic responses, prescribed roles, and socially approved goals. On the other side lies a vast unknown territory where you must learn to navigate by instinct, intuition, and a growing sensitivity to what feels authentic rather than what appears successful. The crossing itself often feels like a kind of death because so much of what you thought you were must be left behind. Campbell understood that this threshold crossing initiates a period of testing that looks nothing like the heroic trials depicted in mythology. Your tests are internal and ongoing, the test of remaining present when others are lost in distraction, the test of speaking truthfully when everyone around you traffics in polite deceptions, the test of maintaining compassion for those who attack what they cannot understand. These trials forge a different kind of strength, not the power to defeat external enemies, but the capacity to remain authentic in a world that rewards conformity. If you found yourself recognizing something true in these words, if you felt that strange mixture of loneliness and freedom that comes with seeing beyond the surface of things, then you're not alone in this journey. There are others walking this path, learning to trust their own inner compass, discovering what it means to live from the inside out rather than the outside in. Consider joining this community of fellow travelers by subscribing and sharing your own experiences in the comments below. Sometimes the most profound conversations happen when people who have been feeling isolated realize they are part of a larger movement toward authenticity and awakeness. The belly of the whale that Campbell described as the hero's complete separation from the familiar world manifests, for the awakening consciousness, as a period of profound disorientation where none of the old strategies for finding meaning and connection seem to work anymore. You discover that you can no longer lose yourself in mindless entertainment, that small talk feels increasingly exhausting, that the career ambitions and social climbing that once seemed important now appear as elaborate distractions from the only questions that matter. Who am I really? What is this life actually for? How do I live with integrity in a world built on illusions? This disorientation is not a problem to be solved, but a necessary dissolution of false identities that must occur before authentic selfhood can emerge. The road of trials unfolds not as external battles, but as an ongoing confrontation with the shadows within your own psyche, the parts of yourself that were shaped by fear, shame, and the desperate need for approval. You must face the ways you have betrayed your own knowing in order to fit in, the compromises you made with truth in order to avoid conflict, the authentic expressions you suppressed because they didn't match the image you thought you needed to project. These shadows are not enemies to be vanquished, but aspects of your humanity to be acknowledged and integrated with compassion. Campbell spoke of the meeting with the goddess as an encounter with the life-giving feminine principle, but for the modern hero this often manifests as a growing relationship with your own intuitive wisdom, your capacity for receptivity and inner listening that has been buried under layers of rational analysis and goal-oriented thinking. You learn to trust the subtle promptings that arise from stillness, to honor the cycles of inspiration and rest that govern creative authenticity, to recognize that some forms of knowledge can only be received, never grasped or conquered. The temptress that Campbell described takes the form of all the ways you are invited to return to unconsciousness, to abandon this difficult path of awakening in favor of more socially acceptable forms of success and happiness. The temptation is not obviously destructive, but rather seductively reasonable. The offer of a promotion that would require you to compromise your values, the relationship that promises security in exchange for authentic self-expression, the spiritual teaching that offers easy answers instead of profound questions. These temptations are particularly dangerous because they offer partial truths wrapped in familiar packages. The atonement with the Father represents a reconciliation with the principle of authority and structure, learning to honor wisdom and tradition without surrendering your own capacity for direct experience and original thinking. You must find a way to respect the container that civilization provides while refusing to be imprisoned by it, to acknowledge the value of collective agreements while maintaining your commitment to personal truth. This integration requires tremendous maturity and discernment. The apotheosis, the moment of divine realization, comes not as a single dramatic revelation, but as a gradual settling into the understanding that you are both utterly ordinary and completely miraculous, that the separation between the spiritual and mundane is itself an illusion, that every moment of authentic presence is already a form of enlightenment. You realize that you were never seeking anything outside yourself, that the treasure was always your own awakened awareness, meeting life directly. The ultimate boon you receive is not a magical object or special power, but a fundamental shift in how you relate to existence itself. You discover that you can live with uncertainty, that you don't need to have all the answers to experience profound peace, that your willingness to remain open and vulnerable is actually your greatest strength. The gift you receive is the capacity to be fully present to life as it unfolds, without needing it to be different than it is. Yet even as these realizations dawn, there's often a reluctance to return fully to ordinary life with its demands and compromises. Part of you wants to remain in the rarefied atmosphere of insight and understanding, to avoid the messy complexity of living these truths in relationship with others who may not understand or appreciate your transformation. The challenge becomes learning to embody your awakening in the most mundane circumstances, to bring the depth of your realization into conversations about weather and weekend plans. If these words resonate with something you've been experiencing but couldn't quite name, know that you're not going crazy or becoming antisocial. You're simply responding to the most natural call of consciousness itself, the invitation to wake up more fully to who you really are. This community exists for those who are walking this path with courage and curiosity. The return phase of the mythic journey that Campbell mapped with such precision reveals itself not as a triumphant homecoming with obvious treasures to share, but as the subtle art of living simultaneously in two worlds, the world of form and appearance where bills must be paid and conversations must be had, and the world of essence and authenticity, where every moment pulses with significance that cannot be explained to those who have not experienced it themselves. The returning hero learns that the greatest victory is not the conquest of external territories, but the integration of awakened awareness into the most ordinary activities of daily existence. Campbell understood that the magic flight often involves a kind of chase, a pursuit by the forces that would drag the hero back into unconsciousness. For the awakening individual, These forces manifest not as mythical creatures, but as the subtle pressure to return to sleep, to abandon the difficult path of authenticity in favor of the easier road of social conformity. The old patterns of thinking and relating exert a gravitational pull, inviting you back into the familiar rhythms of complaint and competition, gossip and judgment. The flight is not a dramatic escape, but a moment-by-moment choice to remain awake when everything around you invites unconsciousness. The rescue from without arrives through unexpected encounters with others who recognize something familiar in your eyes, fellow travelers on this pathless path who offer the gift of understanding without explanation. These connections are rare and precious, marked not by lengthy philosophical discussions, but by a quality of presence that needs no words. When two people who have learned to see through the surface of things meet each other, there is an immediate recognition, a silent acknowledgement that both know the secret that cannot be spoken, that life is far more mysterious and meaningful than it appears, and that most people are sleepwalking through an existence of infinite possibility. Crossing the return threshold requires developing what Campbell called the ability to move fluidly between the ordinary and the sacred, to function effectively in the world of practical concerns while never forgetting the deeper currents that move beneath the surface of apparent reality. You learn to participate fully in the human drama without losing yourself in it, to care deeply about outcomes without clinging to results, to speak the language of your culture while maintaining your connection to the universal truths that transcend all cultural conditioning. The mastery of two worlds manifests as a kind of effortless authenticity, a way of being that honors both the practical necessities of embodied existence and the transcendent mystery that gives life its meaning. You discover that you can love people deeply while seeing through their personas, that you can work diligently for goals that you know are ultimately arbitrary, that you can engage passionately with life while maintaining an inner stillness that nothing can disturb. This mastery is not a destination to be reached, but a dynamic balance to be maintained moment by moment. The freedom to live, Campbell's final stage, reveals itself as the capacity to respond to each situation from presence rather than pattern, to act from authentic choice rather than conditioned reaction. This freedom is not the absence of responsibility, but the ability to choose your responses consciously, to align your actions with your deepest values rather than your immediate impulses or social expectations. You realize that true freedom was never about escaping the human condition, but about inhabiting it fully, with awareness and compassion. The ultimate recognition is that the hero's journey was never about becoming someone special or achieving some extraordinary state of consciousness, but about returning to the natural authenticity that was your birthright before conditioning convinced you that you needed to become someone other than who you are. The treasure you bring back is not esoteric knowledge or spiritual powers, but the simple capacity to be present, to love without conditions, to see beauty in the most ordinary circumstances. Joseph Campbell mapped this journey with the precision of a scholar and the heart of a poet, understanding that every human being carries within themselves the potential for this transformative passage from unconsciousness to awakening. The path is not easy, but it is infinitely worthwhile, leading not to some distant paradise, but to the recognition that paradise was always here, hidden in plain sight, waiting for eyes clear enough to see and hearts open enough to receive the gift of life itself. The danger and the glory of seeing what others cannot see is that you become a bridge between worlds, a living reminder that there is always more than meets the eye, that beneath the surface of ordinary existence flows a river of meaning and mystery that can nourish anyone courageous enough to drink from its waters.